In our study of the Kena Upanishad, we dwelt on the highest conception of Brahman as that delight, the highest experience of Brahman as that delight. Sri Aurobindo made reference to the Taittiriya Upanishad for this purpose, and we explored that connection in a general way, where it describes the Brahman as a fivefold experience, beginning with the material universality of matter as Brahman, the universality of life as Brahman, universality of mind as Brahman, and above that, the supermind and the Satchidananda as the universal oneness bliss. Through these, we have been brought to a deep secret, not only of the nature of the Brahman, but also its impact in the universe. Because that which is the deepest truth of the origin is also the deepest truth of the manifestation. If the deepest reality of Brahman is delight, Anandam, then the deepest truth of all this world experience is also that delight, although concealed. We dwelt on the Taittiriya Upanishad's elaboration of this. We saw also how a person who lives in that delight in the Brahman becomes here on earth an expression and a fountain of that delight as a center of the divine delight, shedding it on all the world, as Sri Aurobindo writes, and attracting all to it as to a fountain of joy and love and self-fulfillment in the universe. And all this that we have seen is the delight revealed, manifested. In an earlier text which we had studied, which is titled, which has been named as the Sri Aurobindo Upanishad, because it was written by Sri Aurobindo, though it is not the title he has given to it. You will recall in our study of it that the center verse, the 10th verse, which is the middle of the entire text, simply this one line translated in English: whatever thus manifests is the world bliss only. Jagadananda is the word in Sanskrit. World bliss, as it has been translated. It could also be translated as bliss as world, Jagad Ananda, or the world as a becoming of bliss. And whatever thus manifests is a becoming of the bliss only, because there is no other. And similarly, in the text of the Thoughts and Glimpses of Sri Aurobindo, there is the same idea. In one of the passages he writes, delight is the secret, learn of pure delight, and thou shalt learn of God. And so this has been the theme of our meditation, dwelling on the text of the Kena and Sri Aurobindo's commentary for the last 2 sessions. But we will now turn that theme to a different direction. You will recall the mother describing the discussions between Paul Richard and Sri Aurobindo on this point of difference, where Paul Richard coming from an occult spiritual tradition from the West, largely based in the Kabbalah and in the Judaic tradition. He insisted that the origin of the universe is in the will of the divine, in the will to manifest. Sri Aurobindo insisted that the origin was not in the will, but in the delight. Out of sheer delight, the divine chooses to flow to manifest the delight. The will is only the mechanism of his delight manifesting. And this was a point of difference. Why is this important? It's not a mere philosophical debate. Because if the origin is understood differently, then all the rest is seen differently. What would be the natural consequence if we accepted the origin of the universe as being the divine will at the source? And we find Sri Aurobindo answering this in a different way in his Thoughts and Aphorisms, where he describes the result of this idea. So I will, there are two aphorisms. I will read the whole of both. When will the world change into the model of heaven? When all mankind becomes boys and girls together with God, revealed as Krishna and Kali, the happiest boy and strongest girl of the crowd, playing together in the gardens of paradise. So you see, the scene he has set is one of a play of delight. And then he says, the Semitic Eden was well enough, but Adam and Eve were too grown up, and its God himself too old and stern and solemn for the offer of the serpent to be resisted. So because God is so solemn and stern and old, when the serpent makes an offer, here I'll give you something better, then Adam and Eve couldn't quite resist that offer. But if there had been these young boys and girls playing together, then that delight would have been so fulfilling, there could be no other temptation which could take you anywhere else. Well, the very next aphorism goes, the Semites have afflicted mankind with the conception of a God who is a stern and dignified king and solemn judge and knows not mirth. He cannot joke. But we who have seen Krishna know him for a boy fond of play and a child full of mischief and happy laughter. So he's again showing you the two images of the divine, and you see the core of it is this starting point. What is the highest conception of the divine from which the universe is born? If it is will, then the will rules and dominates everything in the universe. And what does will do? Stern, dignified king. What it has decided, everything must follow. It compels, it dominates. And if something does not fit in, something does not follow, he becomes the solemn judge. And as the judge, of course, he offers you reward, punishment. And he cannot laugh, because that's the nature of the will. It is simply a push. But if instead the origin is the play of delight, everything is full of play, mischief, and happy laughter. And it allows for the play, even for the play of error and the play of deviation or self-loss and self-discovery and all the rest. And all rests on this initial conception. There is another set of two aphorisms in which he summarizes this difference. So first he says, to fear God really is to remove oneself to a distance from Him. But to fear Him in play gives an edge to utter delightfulness. So we see the place for that fear, but in the play. If you only fear, then you only experience the distance. And so the consequence, he says, the Jew invented the God-fearing man. India, the God-knower and God-lover. And you will see this in the Semitic traditions, in the Abrahamic traditions generally, in the Jewish tradition, in Christianity, and in Islam. At the origin is somewhere this idea of fearing God. And it has become so steeped that it has become part of the common vocabulary. When you appreciate a person as being very religious, then you say, oh, he's a God-fearing person, meaning he is very religious and he will never do something wrong or harmful to others. How serious this is in terms of the harm it has caused to humanity. We understand when in the previous aphorism we read, the Semites have afflicted mankind with the conception of a God who is stern. It is an affliction. It is a harmful, almost disease, to have this relationship of fear because of the separation that it creates. But what you have here instead is the God-knower and God-lover. And in knowing God, you find intimacy of closeness. In loving God, you find the union. And in the next aphorism, he says, again, the consequence of that in your relationship with the divine. The servant of God was born in Judea, but he came to maturity among the Arabs. So, you see, it starts in the Jewish tradition that you have this idea of the servant of God. Because he is this authority, you have to serve and obey. But the idea of servant can go a step further, and it can become a self-giving, and that is what you see formulated, at least originally, in the sense of Islam. The very word Islam is surrender to the will of the divine. But it's the culmination of the idea coming into maturity of being the servant of God. On the other hand, he says, India's joy is in the servant lover. So you serve, but you serve the beloved. And in the love, the service becomes a joy, not an oppression, not the slavery which normally we would associate with being a servant. And so these indicate to us how important this original conception of the divine and the origin of creation is, because finally it fills everything else. The entire philosophy, the entire religion, the spiritual teaching, the practices even, and the social constructs are shot through and through with this idea. So you will see in the Abrahamic traditions, following the order of God, following the 10 Commandments, following the law, the written book becomes so important. Because everything originated in the will, and the will is the law. And if you deviate from that, then you have to have the most extreme forms of punishment. But if the whole origin is for the purpose of the play, then even in the loss and deviation, you see the play becoming more complex, more rich, but it is still a play. And that's why Sri Aurobindo has other aphorisms which develop this idea, where he speaks of the humor of God being sometimes quite coarse, even for human ears, because that's the nature of the play. The play allows not only for the sophisticated relation of the delight and the harmony, but also the most extreme and even the most absurd possibilities. That's why he says, a God who doesn't have a humor, I'm just paraphrasing, a God who is not humorous couldn't have created such a wonderful universe. And he write in one of the aphorisms, he says, if men took life less seriously, they could very soon make it more perfect. God never takes his works seriously. Therefore, one looks out on this wonderful universe. So the sense of humor and the play is ingrained in all the experiences, even in the very form and the manner in which the world is developed and formed. So we come to this idea of the delight. Now, in its consequence, in this concealed play of delight that is our life, we are bound in ignorance, we are bound in separation, we are cut off from the oneness, we are unable to experience the delight, at least in our surface, human nature. The delight is concealed. But the play continues because that's the essential character of this universe and the origin of it. And you see what happens there. You will recall Sri Aurobindo's this very suggestive line. He says, the all blissful Ananda of which the Taittiriya Upanishad speaks as the highest Brahman, from which all existences are born, by which all existences live and increase, and into which all existences arrive in their passing out of death and birth. So, being born from the delight and returning to the delight in our liberation, we have also explored sufficiently. But this in between, that the delight by which all existences live and increase, this is what we want to explore. Because although we do not live in the delight as we are now, it is by the delight that everything lives. And by the delight that everything increases, grows, evolves. And how? Underlying every experience is still the delight. And this idea we have looked at in other circumstances. Even when we are unhappy, even when we are miserable, there is a part within us which looks at that whole experience and says, oh, this is so fascinating as an experience. And it reflects in the more surface ego distortion that goes like, I am so miserable, and I want to wallow in that misery as a way of exploring how far it goes. I remember once it happened, somebody had come here, a young girl who was going through an extreme internal crisis, was suicidal. I think she had already attempted suicide, was in severe depression, had been on heavy medication for several years, and as a last resort, unable to do anything, somebody sent her to Pondicherry, and somehow she met someone, and well, we ended up having a chat. And so everybody had attempted to convince her that no, things are not so bad and she's not in the worst condition, she's not the worst person. And so sitting with her, I was listening to all this self-indulgence in sadness and depression. And at some point the vocabulary took the form, she said, I am the most miserable, the worst, and everything is bad. I am the most horrible person in the universe. If only you knew all my thoughts and feelings. And I said to her, yes, that's true. Let's just accept you're the most horrible person. You're the most miserable. You deserve to not exist and to die and to commit suicide and everything. And my friend went, oh, what are you saying? And the thing was, while she was in the self-indulgent state, when I said this, she looked at me in surprise. What is this fellow saying? Because nobody had said that to her. And then she began to laugh. And then I said, fine, having become the worst, where can you go now? The only way you can go is forward. There's nothing left to get worse, right? And she began to laugh. And from that point on, the whole rhythm changed. And she was laughing and smiling and becoming more and more bubbling. And then the other friend filled in with whatever was needed. And she said, I don't need my medication anymore. She just threw out the medication, and she was fine for a few weeks at least. Until at some point her parents said, well, at least meet the doctor. Tell him that you have stopped the medication. And her doctor said to her, well, if you're going to live in Pondicherry, you can live without medication. But if you're going to live here, you better start the medication, otherwise I'm not responsible for you. And bang, she went back into medication, and I don't know what happened. But what was interesting is, in this self-indulgence of self-pity and misery, which Mother has called an extreme form of egoism, depression, when suddenly faced with this thing saying, yes, you're right, it broke that pattern, and there was acceptance. Yes, now what? And then there's the positive forward movement, which meant all the time behind that screen of self-pity was something enjoying, in a perverse way. But behind that was the true delight. Here's an experience. Here's the point of being caught, being trapped, unable to free yourself. Wow, what an interesting experience. And as long as that thing sanctioned it, the person could live in that wallowing self-pity. When that thing said, okay, enough of this, poof, the turn began. And so what we are noticing here, even in our condition of being bound in ignorance, unable to experience the delight, there is something on a deeper level which always has it. I recall another interesting example which happened with one of my students. We were in a class, and this girl had missed her class because she was in fever. And she came and she was very unhappy. She said, I missed so many interesting things. And I was in fever, and I prayed, but I didn't get well. I prayed to the Mother. And you could feel this intense anxiety of the prayer. And so I had to address that, because otherwise she would lose her faith. And I said to her, you know what, the way you prayed in this agitation, that's not the best way to pray. I said, just try to feel behind this agitation, there's something very quiet inside. And instantly she turned in. And I said, once you reach that quiet place, from there you call. And she was quiet for a few seconds, and then suddenly the smile burst on her face, and she said, oh, it's so beautiful. Just behind that agitation and anxiety was that space where there was delight. And because it's there, even the agitation, even the tension, even the suffering, even the pain that we go through in life is justified, is made acceptable. And because it is there, everything becomes possible and survives. You will recall the line from Savitri, because he is there, the world forgets to die. But this is one side. It is that delight which is by which all existences live. But then the second aspect to it, by which all existences increase. And we notice how this works. Because that delight is there, on the surface, we know it's possible, and yet we know we don't have it. If it was not there somewhere inside, we could never know that even delight is possible in life. We could never know that we don't have it. We would just be what we are, like an automaton, like a robot. Robot doesn't know what it doesn't know. It is what it is. It doesn't know what it lacks. You know what you lack because somewhere inside you already have it concealed. Otherwise you wouldn't know you lacked it. In fact, often it happens in life for those who have grown up in a very disconnected social circumstance where the spiritual touch was entirely missing. They don't even know what they miss. And then one day they come in touch with something which is like a fountain for the spiritual nourishment, and suddenly they realize all their life they had a thirst, and they didn't know they were thirsty until they tasted this. And now you know that this is what I was missing. Because I had never known that it's there, I didn't know it existed. I didn't know what I was missing. This is what happens in us. Somewhere inside there is that thing, and therefore we know it is possible, and therefore we yearn, but we don't know what it is that we yearn for. And this yearning becomes the goad, the drive by which we are always trying to move forward. In the mind, it takes the form of seeking for something better, something more perfect, something better organized, something more structured, more ordered. In the emotions, it is for more happiness, more joy, more satisfaction. Even in the senses, it is for some kind of a deep satisfaction, which generally takes the form of pleasure. But what you seek is not the pleasure, not the happiness, but the satisfaction which comes from it. This is the secret. So try, for example, to chase after happiness and happiness, happiness. Eventually you get bored of it because it doesn't satisfy. A sustained happiness very quickly becomes something you're used to. What you're seeking is not happiness but a deeper kind of satisfaction. And the sense of satisfaction is felt when you experience growth, you experience change. Some movement that takes you closer to the delight, the divine. In the mind, it takes the form of growth of knowledge, widening of mind, widening of perspective, becoming more plastic, more clear, more bright, more aware. In the emotions, it takes the form of a greater widening, embracing, joy, love, sharing, exchange, self-giving. Even in the senses, similarly, it is always a sense of some form of growth beyond limitation. In other words, all growth is driven by this call of the delight, or by the faint memory of the delight which you have forgotten, now being sought out. And the approach to the delight, or the seizing or claiming of the delight, even indirectly or as a reflection, is the experience of growth. Or growth is delight. When you grow, you experience joy. When you don't grow, it becomes a monotone, no joy. So this is that deeper principle which is pointing to the highest Brahman, Anandam, by which all existences live and increase, by which all existences are born, by which all existences live and increase, and into which all existences arrive. So both the living, being sustained, as well as the increase that take place are also part of this working of the delight, and possible because of the delight. So we move now to the next verses which we have read last time. Thou hast said, speak to me, Upanishad. Spoken to thee is Upanishad. Of the eternal verily is the Upanishad that we have spoken. And we saw last time the sense of this speaking, which is a movement of manifesting that which you are speaking of. If your words do not convey the idea or the experience behind, well, they are simply vibrations of sound with no meaning. It is the meaning which the words carry, and the meaning is an expression of the experience. And so, when in the Veda they speak of Vak, it is the speech manifesting experience. So thou hast said, speak to me, Upanishad. That is, there was a call, there was an aspiration from humanity. Reveal this knowledge which takes you to the deepest self. That is the Upanishad. Spoken to thee is Upanishad. And of the eternal verily is this Upanishad we have revealed, manifested, imprinted, spoken. And this is the sense of the verse. Sri Aurobindo, in his commentary, writes, this is the culmination of the teaching of the Upanishad. There was a demand for the secret teaching that enters into the ultimate truth, for the Upanishad. And in response, this doctrine has been given. It has been uttered, the Upanishad of the Brahman, the hidden ultimate truth of the supreme existence. Now this Upanishad of the Brahman, what has it revealed? The hidden ultimate truth of the supreme existence. There is existence. We are existing. The world is existing. But there are many levels of existence. The supreme existence is what we seek. It has many truths. And it can be known as and through many different truths. It is known through love, it is known through will, it is known through oneness, it is known through multiplicity. But we seek the ultimate truth of the Supreme Existence. And that ultimate truth is hidden. It is not known to us even in our highest approach and needs to be revealed. And therefore, he writes, it has been uttered, the Upanishad of the Brahman, the hidden ultimate truths of the Supreme Existence. You see, it is so well hidden that, as you can see in the Judaic tradition, in the Semitic tradition, the highest they could reach was the will. They could not cross beyond the will to that which was hidden behind the delight. And there are many traditions which have gone very far but missed that last step, which makes the whole world so worthwhile. So if this has been uttered, what was the rhythm in which the movement of the utterance took place? Sri Aurobindo summarizes the big picture. Its beginning was the search for the Lord, master of mind, life, speech and senses, in whom is the absolute mind, the absolute life, the absolute speech and senses. This is how the journey began. In the first part of the Kena, when the question was asked, what is mind of our mind? And we were pointed to the absolute of mind, the absolute of everything. Now, if we generally take it, and we again, since we're taking a big picture, general view, take anything in life, take it to a higher level, take it to a higher possibility, take it to its highest that you can conceive of. It is still in the relative. Now take it all the way into its absolute. Until at some point it seems to go beyond form, beyond limits, beyond barriers. Take it to its absolute and you will find that, the Lord. So the search for the Lord, the master of mind, life, speech and sense, in whom is the absolute of mind, life, speech and sense. And everything else finds its absolute in the Lord. Then, the close of this was the beginning. The close is the finding of Him as the transcendent beatitude. So we go beyond our initial conception of the Lord all the way to the transcendence and the beatitude which is transcendent. Not only we find Him in that, we are changed as a result. So, and the elevation of the soul that finds and possesses it into a living center of that delight. So it could be that you find it outside and you leave behind everything else which remains what it was. But here in the finding, the purpose was to lift the soul to not only find but to possess. And when you possess here in the world, the elevation of the soul that finds and possesses it into a living center of that delight, towards which all creatures in the universe shall turn as to the fountain of its ecstasies, to the fountain of the ecstasies of that delight. And this was the overall frame of the Upanishad teaching. And what about the last two verses where this is being said? Of this knowledge, austerity and self-conquest and works are the foundation. The Vedas are its limbs, truth is its dwelling place. He who knows this knowledge smites away evil from him, and in that vaster world and infinite heaven finds his foundation, yea, he finds his foundation. These two verses, they are not quite part of the teaching. The teaching has been done, and what they show now is something which is a support for the teaching or the practice, and showing you the consequence of the teaching and practice. Of this, Sri Aurobindo has an interesting observation. He says, this is the typical pattern of the teachings of the Upanishads. You will find subsequently similar patterns in all other teachings, because they all follow that same inspirational format. Even in the later texts of the Puranic or the Tantric, whenever there is a revelation given, The culmination of it is this has been taught, and one who follows this and practices this will gain so much and will become like this, will be liberated, will have 100 sons, or whatever the promise of the teaching itself. But this pattern we see here. But obviously, this is one of the high Upanishads, and it is not given casually. There is something profound there which we have to also now discover. So Sri Aurobindo says this. The Upanishad closes with two verses which seem to review and characterize the whole work in the manner of the ancient writings when they have gone to their close. So all the ancient writings at the closure have this manner. This Upanishad, or Gospel of the inmost truth of things. You see, again he defines the term Upanishad. Gospel of the inmost truth of things. Has for its foundation, it is said, the practice of self-mastery, action, and the subdual of the sense life to the power of the spirit. Subduing, putting under a higher power. You have a wild horse. Why is it wild? Because it is driven by its own impulses. You subdue the wild horse. First you pacify the impulse, and then you teach the horse to obey the rider. And at that point it is tame, it is trained, it is subdued. Meaning it now consciously serves a higher principle. So the subduing here is of the sense life to the power of the spirit. What's our life? We live in the senses. Everything is defined by what we see and what the senses trigger in our emotions and our thoughts. This sense life is now subdued to the power of the spirit. So there are three things which are the means of arriving to this consciousness by which we put into practice the teaching of this Upanishad. The practice of self-mastery, action, and subdual of the sense life to the power of the spirit. In the text of the Kena, it goes like this. Of this knowledge, austerity and self-conquest and works are the foundation. Of course, in translating into English, we lose a few things. So looking at the Sanskrit words, we see tasya, of this. It doesn't mention knowledge. Of this, and this means now the entire teaching. Of this. Remember, you're at the close of the teaching, and now she says, of this. What is this? All that we have read and all the experience that it contains. Of this, tapas, dhamma, and karma are the pratishtha, foundation. So tapas, Sri Aurobindo has translated it as austerity, for lack of a better word, but in other writings he has elaborated on the sense of tapas, which is the concentration of consciousness to a single purpose, which as a result of concentration generates heat and light. Now this is something which is so profound, it acts on all the levels of the cosmos. On the physical level, if you take air and compress it, it becomes hot. If you compress it enough, it becomes so hot it starts glowing. This is the basis of sonoluminescence, if you've ever heard of that term, where you take water, punch into it sound vibrations, which create bubbles, and tiny bubbles, which are then made to collapse by the sound vibration. So the tiny bubbles of air may be already there, and you punch the sound vibration to crush and collapse the wave. At that moment, when the air inside the water is being compressed, it becomes so hot that it reaches temperatures higher than the sun. And there's a momentary flash of blue light because of the heat that is generated. So with sound, you create light in the water bubbles, sonoluminescence. And there is the hope that through such means you will be able to generate energy and create some kind of fusion and all that stuff. But this is really the same idea. You take air, compress it, it becomes not only hot, but it generates heat and light. Take anything and compress it, it becomes hot and illuminated. This is on the physical level, a reflection of the principle of pure consciousness. If you take consciousness, condense and compress it, how do you do that? How do you condense or compress consciousness? Concentrate awareness. I'm aware of everything around me, and now I gather that awareness, bring it into a single point of focus. Now I'm aware only of this point of the needle. I'm aware only of this grain of sand, or this spot on the wall, or this flower, or this atom, whatever it is. And that concentration, when it becomes exclusive and all your awareness is on that one point, like the laser beam, the light narrowed and brought into one point, it cuts through the form. The heat of that, the tapas, dissolves appearances and barriers and gives light of revelation of knowledge in the identification. Mother puts it in less dramatic terms. She says, if you gather all your attention on a single idea or a single problem, and if you stay in it until everything else fades out, eventually you break through and the knowledge is revealed to you. You become one with the thing on which you concentrate and the knowledge is revealed. All knowledge is known by such means. There is no other means. Very important statement. There is no other way by which you can know something except by concentration of awareness leading to identification and revelation through light, tapas. Whether diluted or whether intensified, this is the only way of knowing. And so when we speak of a rishi doing tapas or tapasya, it is this gathered concentration which he brings into his awareness as a state, dwelling upon what he wishes to know, which is of course the highest divine, and maintaining and holding that state. So when a rishi is in tapasya for so many years, it is the state of holding that, and as a result deepening and perhaps going through many layers of revelation or experience or identification in that which he seeks to know. This is the most essential and only way by which knowledge is. That principle on pure consciousness reflects all the way down, even in material processes, as we have seen. But the same thing happens with our energies, life force also, when we seek to change something. You want to heal an injury? Gather your energies, intensify and focus them. It generates heat and light, which is literally experienced. If it's on the body, the part of the body becomes warm when you become aware of it. And it increases in awareness that it becomes lit up, the consciousness becomes lit up. And so the sense of tapas now we can appreciate from this when it says, of this knowledge or revelation, tapas, self-conquest, and works are the foundation. So your first foundation given is tapas. If you do not have tapas, you can do nothing. Second foundation given here in the Kena text is self-conquest, dhamma. Interestingly, Sri Aurobindo in his commentary exchanges the sequence of action and self-conquest. Sri Aurobindo puts action first and then self-conquest. What is he hinting at? Sri Aurobindo never does something casually. If he has done it, there's a purpose. So first let's see the rationale of the Kena. As a result of the tapas, as a result of the concentration, you acquire a certain poise of consciousness in which you can now receive, you can know, or you can realize whatever it is that you seek. The second thing is self-conquest. In this process of knowing something, I have just discovered, I have experienced a certain state. What happens inside you? You experience a contrast, an opposition. There is this, and then there is what was. I've received a certain illumination, and then there is all the rest of me which is not an illumination. What do you do next? Dhamma. Subdue. Subdue the horse to the rider. And who is the horse here? All the earlier lower tendencies, passions, ego, desire, and all the old habitual animal instincts, bundle of what you were before. Against this new consciousness which has been revealed as a result of the tapas, and this has now to become the rider, this has to lead the horse has to be subdued. And so the second step in the kena is self-conquest by this higher consciousness attained. Now the tapas may not yet have taken you to the highest, but every step of the ascent, as a result of tapas, you now bring into the rest of your being, subdue, and bring the rest under influence of this, that it should lead self-conquest from this higher poise. And this becomes the second foundation, therefore. And third, when this is done, and to the extent that this is done, this must now extend into the action of all the parts of my being. In my thoughts, in my energies, in my emotions, in my will, and all my actions. It is this which should lead. So, the third foundation is the action which then makes established in life the truth of that which is revealed by the first step of the tapas. So of this knowledge of the kena, revelation, tapas, self-conquest, and works are the foundation. Upon this foundation will be the full flowering out of your possibilities, of which the limbs are the Vedas, and the truth is its dwelling place. We'll look at that later. But we have looked at the foundation in these three steps. In Sri Aurobindo's commentary, there is this switch, and let's see what that suggests for us. He says, this Upanishad, or gospel of the inmost truth of things, has for its foundation, it is said, the practice of self-mastery, action, and the subdual of the sense life to the power of the spirit. So the tapas is translated as here, practice of self-mastery. In other words, life and works are to be used as a means of arriving out of the state of subjection proper to the soul in the ignorance into a state of mastery, which brings it nearer to the absolute self-mastery and the all-mastery of the Supreme Soul seated in knowledge. So he has given it a practical form in which life and works are the starting point. The framework of Karma Yoga itself begins with this, and the tapas is not a muted concentration inward, upward, in some indrawn state, but it is the tapas applied in practice of self-mastery, in the action, and in that whole movement you subdue the sense life to the power of the spirit. So what Sri Aurobindo has done is to give priority to the action, that you begin now in what you are doing. You do not need to step out of life to build a base from which you will be able to re-enter life. You begin where you are in the midst of your life itself. And this slight shift is changing the form of the practice, or the priority in the practice. And through this self-mastery, the whole theme is made one of self-mastery, of the subjection proper to the soul in ignorance. That subjection is now replaced by a higher mastery, going all the way to the highest. all mastery of the Supreme Soul seated in the knowledge, which now is the master, which now dominates your whole being and leads all activities of life and makes you an instrument. So you see, the theme in which Sri Aurobindo has aligned the whole process is one of progressive steps of mastery. Well, first your mind has to master, your higher part has to master, there's still the personal effort, but all the way until you submit to the divine, which becomes the master, and its mastery is what acts. And of the next step now, the foundation being laid, the next step, the Vedas are all its limbs. What is the Veda and why is it the limbs of this knowledge? And then finally, truth is its dwelling place. What does that mean? So in the Sanskrit, it is Veda Sarvangani. Anga is limb. You may, in the root sense of the sound, it is the see, it has the similarity with Agni, the movement of the concentration of the will and the light, but in a specific narrow direction, a limited aspect put forward. And this is the way we would describe our limbs. It's one body putting out an arm and another arm and a leg, those become the limbs. But there is special concentration, a special aspect. And the Vedas is Sarvangani, so all the limbs included, no limb is missed. So of this, Sri Aurobindo's commentary goes like this. The Vedas, that is to say, the utterances of the inspired seers and the truths they hold are described as the limbs of the Upanishad. In other words, all the convergent lines and aspects, all the necessary elements of this great practice, this profound psychological self-training and spiritual aspiration are set forth in these great scriptures, channels of supreme knowledge and indicators of a supreme discipline. So Sri Aurobindo's commentary now gives you an understanding. You see how the limbs function in relation to the central thing of which the limbs are. The limbs act as projections outward. They also act as the means by which you come to the center. So your hand reaches out to grasp, but by your hand what you grasp is brought in to eat, to absorb. So the limbs here, Sri Aurobindo describes as the convergent lines and aspects. If you take a diamond, how would you know the diamond completely? Only if you look at each of its facets, and through each facet you see the whole diamond. But first you do not see the whole diamond, you see the facet from far, just a shape, surface. You come close to the surface and through it you peer inside. So the limb is a point of contact at first, and from that point of contact there is a direction in which the limb goes to join to its source. So all the limbs, nothing is left out, all the limbs are convergent lines. They all converge to the same center. But you begin with these limbs. So all the convergent lines and aspects, each is an aspect, it catches an aspect of the truth. All the necessary elements of this great practice, this is what they are. You need them all, you cannot miss any of them for this great practice. And this profound psychological self-training and spiritual aspiration. Now he's making a pretty bold claim that here is a profound psychological system of training. And there is a profound psychological means and a spiritual aspiration given to you as a knowledge. The full scope of this we can appreciate only when we have studied verse by verse, seeing how each of those verses lead us to not only deeper insight on multiple levels, but also suggest a form of practice or guide you through your practice. And we have been covering all that during our exploration of the text. But what he's saying here is a complete system of practice as well as a system of knowledge. And spiritual aspiration. Every step, starting perhaps from different facets, but taking them all towards this. Are set forth in these great scriptures, channels of supreme knowledge and indicators of a supreme discipline. So they are actually channels by which this knowledge has been given to you and leads you back to its source. And they indicate each a supreme discipline. Now, if we had to go back to review the whole text from this perspective, you will discover in the whole thing elements which correspond to practices of karma yoga, bhakti yoga, or jnana yoga, or various other principles used as levers in different yogic systems. You would find them all in some way as hints, as suggestions, as indicators. And right at the beginning, not of this text, but in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad, Sri Aurobindo has taught us that the manner in which the Upanishads teach is not by a logically reasoned out structure, but by a series of intuitive revelations which point to things and suggest to your mind not one thing but many layered insights. And so what are these formulations? He says, the Vedas, that is to say, the utterances of the inspired seers and the truths they hold are described as the limbs of the Upanishad. So these utterances came from the inspired seer. Because he is inspired, it is not he creating it. He is only the vehicle through whom the articulation is taking place. The truth that he lives in is being revealed through the inspiration, through these rhythmically formulated verses, structured according to that inspiration. Now, when such a thing takes place, the Rishi himself has no claim over what is taught. He is only the singer. He is only the articulator, the inspired poet. But he doesn't say, I have composed. So in the Veda you will find there are names of the Rishis given to various verses, hymns which they have sung, and yet the Veda is described as apaurushaya, that is not articulated by human. Purusha, individual. No individual is the author of the Vedas. And because exactly they didn't create it, they only transmitted in this inspired speech. So, utterances of the inspired seers, but that's not all. And the truth they hold. So Vedas, Sri Aurobindo defines as utterances of the inspired seers, and the truths they hold are described as the limbs. So it's not the utterance, but the power infused in the utterance. Both of these together is what makes for the Veda. And this is the reason why the Vedic texts were never permitted to be written down. They were taught orally so that this power of inspiration is transmitted in the oral transmission. If you write it on a piece of paper, you pick up a book and read, you do not have the same impact as a person speaking it out from a living experience that he holds. If you're sensitive enough, you can still read the book and tune in to receive something of that. But otherwise, in the reading, if you do not connect to the source, then you can pretty much give it a form which is of your own mind's construction or understanding. And yet, if the inspiration is powerful enough, something does come through. And if you catch it, then it can lead you back all the way as if it is being spoken to you. And I share here two examples of this. This was one of the young girls who came to the ashram when she was 13 the first time, later at 16. And because she was not yet old enough to be able to stay as an adult, she had to go back. Going back with the text, the book of the Life Divine, this was in the 1940s, she would go to her terrace in the town she was living in, open the book and start reading. Now this is, remember, 16-year-old girl reading the Life Divine. You can understand English was not her native language. She knew English, and the text of the Life Divine was so difficult, as we have all experienced at some time or other. And she says, as she read, she heard the voice of Sri Aurobindo reading it out. And as she followed that, the meaning became clear and it was obvious. And this is the link made with the inspiration. And it can take literally, practically, physically this form. Not all will hear the voice as the voice of Sri Aurobindo. They may simply receive the pouring without any particular voice of the inspiration which reveals, and the brain is filled with the light of the inspiration, and your mind awakened to see what is being shown to you, and the consciousness uplifted to experience, or at least glimpse an experience of that. And that's the power Sri Aurobindo has put as, and it is that infusion of power which makes it Veda. Veda is not knowledge. It is the experience and the power of experience infused in the form of the knowledge, which is what makes it Veda. And the second example I give is the particular importance that the mother gave to assisting in making this link. And, well, there are two branches to this example. First was, she said, all the books of Sri Aurobindo which were published in the ashram press, all the copies had to be brought to her room and placed before her. She would gaze upon them, and then they were to be taken down for the sales or distribution. And she explained that it was because she was infusing into them the consciousness that would allow the reader to take the book and connect to the consciousness. And this is, to this day, the infusion that she has made is valid, is still active. If you take a book of the early 40s, 50s, or even early 60s, you hold the book, and even without knowing what's in it, you can feel the touch of that infusion which is there. You know it is of that period. And then you can look inside and verify the date. And then mother complained later to the person who was looking after the press at that point. She said, but now they don't listen to me anymore. They think she's just an old woman and she's asking for something silly to be done. They don't bring it, they send me only one copy of the book. And she made this complaint explicitly, and this was narrated to me by the man who actually heard it from her, Robi Ganguly, for those who might know him. He's passed away now. But this purpose of her intention to link, to infuse that power, was so that as you took the book, the link was made. And then the book itself becomes a vehicle, the teacher himself, and the teacher's consciousness flows through the words as you read, giving you the imprint and the experience. And the second aspect to this was her observation that in the reading room in the ashram, she had put a special power, that when you sat there to read, it would make it possible for you to understand and to receive Sri Aurobindo's influence for this in this way. Of course, the principle is valid even today, even if that exercise is not done. If you take a book written by Sri Aurobindo, place it before him. Invoke his light, invoke the mother's consciousness. Ask them to receive, to give you that illumination, and take it with that attunement, and you will have the same benefit. But it is this which is the character of the Veda, and the reason why the Vedic knowledge was always orally transmitted. So now we appreciate this one phrase of the Kena, of this knowledge The Vedas are all its limbs, all its limbs. It is a comprehensive system, nothing is left out. And Sri Aurobindo's commentary, we reread the Vedas, that is to say, the utterances of the inspired seers and the truths they hold, are described as all the limbs of the Upanishad. In other words, all the convergent lines and aspects, all the necessary elements of this great practice, this profound psychological self-training and spiritual aspiration, are set forth in these great scriptures, channels of supreme knowledge and indicators of a supreme discipline. If we appreciate what that does when there is such an inspired formulation, we will notice how it takes unusual forms. And I've placed this as an interesting example, that if you take the Vedas, the various chapters, simply count the number of verses, you will find numbers match the rotational period of the planets of our solar system. There are cosmic numerical values embedded in the numbers of the verses and in their arrangement. This is quite exceptional. In the Bhagavad Gita, similarly, if you divide half the chapters one side, half the chapters on the other side, count the number of verses in each of the halves, divide one by the other, you get pi to the 4th decimal place, I think. Amazing. And then there is a tradition in the lineage of the Gita that says that there is one hidden verse, lupta, which is lost, forgotten. So that one number, if you add to this side, then you get pi to the 5th or 6th decimal place, some extraordinary number. Now, it's not that the composer or the inspired seer sought to put these numbers in, but in the very act of a revealed knowledge of what? Of a complete experience, which holds in itself all the cosmic harmonies. When that formulates itself in a harmony of verses which are sung, they are a representation of the cosmic harmonies which also pour out from the same source. And so the resonance, and it only goes to confirm, this is so. It is an inspired teaching. It could not have been otherwise. Of course, the experience is the greatest confirmation. Similarly, in Sri Aurobindo's Savitri, there are interesting numbers. Not much exploration has been made, but there is one line which describes 12 months having passed from the time when the prophecy was made of Satyavan's death, and now Savitri looks at the day returning. This day returning, Satyavan must die. 12 months have passed in that one line. And that line is the 365th line of Savitri. Exactly 1 year if you take one line per day. And you find, how did this happen? It's not that Sri Aurobindo calculated or measured out. It's just the way the inspiration flowed, it caught these. These are more symptoms or symbols of the inspiration flowing. And so we will pause with this for today. There is still one more element remaining. Truth is the dwelling place of this knowledge. What does that mean? And Sri Aurobindo's elaboration. And we will see how profound these suggestions are and how much confidence they give us, and they indicate also the direction and form for the practice. But remember, the name of that is that delight. As that delight, one should follow after it. You can meditate on this for a few minutes.